Welcome to the Genderless Space, Masculinity, Indigenous Poetics, and Becoming, a dialogue between Smokii Sumac and Sam McKegney. I'm Sam McKegney, a Settler Scholar of Indigenous Literatures at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, in the territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. I'm speaking to you from my office at the university, and I therefore remind you that I'm at the Queen's University in the King's Town, and that settler colonialism is not an inheritance or remnant of the past, but rather the territory in which we exist, the terrain of our daily existence. I'd like to throw things over to Smokii to introduce himself.
Smokii Sumac. Hi, I'm Smokii. I'm coming to you from Amakwestunakpa. I live in a town that I guess the majority of people call Kimberley, British Columbia, and back in my home territory. And today it's an honor to be working with Sam, who has been a mentor of mine for many years in the Indigenous literary family and community that we have. And before we start, I want to say that I'm sharing with you Quill Christy Peters' work here that I am honored to have in my home and wake up to every morning, and I wanted to share with you for this specific discussion because I think it's extremely powerful. And Quill is Anishinaabe and had a baby, I think, 3 days ago. So welcome to the world, Jesus. And yeah, wanted to open there.
Wonderful. That's such a striking image, and I'm glad it'll be in the background throughout our conversations. It does certainly resonate with things that we want to talk about. So I'll tell you a little bit about what has precipitated this discussion. As Smokii mentioned, he and I have known each other for, well, over a decade now. And we've, worked in similar circles, and whereas I have tended to be in the critical realm, Smokii's work transitions between creativity and critical work and activism and pedagogy, and brings all of those things together. And I was recently putting the finishing touches on a book called Carrying the Burden of Peace, Indigenous Masculinities and Story. And I turned to Smokii's work for a number of reasons. And foremost among them is the way that Smokii's poetry continues to acknowledge masculinity as an aspirational value, but not simply in the ways that we have inherited it. And so I think that is extremely important because masculinities can be teachings, can be medicines, can be forms of ceremony, but only if we unshackle them from the inheritances of settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy. And so I think Smokii's work has been extremely important in helping me understand the kinds of discussions around gender and masculinity I believe we need to be having, and also in pushing that conversation in a creative direction, a direction where we don't simply accept what we have come to understand as masculinity, but rather we refuse those negative aspects that have harmed us in our communities, and we seek after other horizons of possibility.
If I can't trust men, and trust me, I've tried to find men who deserve trust. Without trusting men, how do I become a man worthy of trust?
When I read those lines in your collection of poetry, they stopped me in my tracks for a number of reasons. Firstly, they acknowledge the ways in which manhood or masculinity has been saddled with a violent history, and yet they are aspirational words. And they also honor trust as a central value around identity. So I wondered if you might talk me through those lines, and why was it important in the collection to speak about those issues?
So just a little background on the collection. The collection You Are Enough, Love Poems for the End of the World, with Kegadon's Press. A little background on it is that I, for those who weren't part of my social media in 2016 to 2018, I was writing sort of under a hashtag haiku a day. I was writing poems almost daily. And it was at a time of transition for me, but it was also, I had a writing mentor that just said, try a haiku a day. You can do 13 syllables a day, right? So it became this practice. And in that practice, what happened was there were days, some of the things that didn't make it into the book, as an example, is like I had a series when my cat had fleas. So there was a whole flea series of haiku. So it became this sort of journal. But at the same time, as Indigenous people, everything we do is political. As who I am, I'm somebody who's always paying attention to the news, like currently watching Black Lives Matter, watching, being aware of what's happening around us in communities of color and Indigenous communities and Black communities. And so at that time, there was, like, we're kind of locating it in sort of the Jian Gomeshi time. We even, like, there was some allegations against Wap Canoe. There was some allegations. There was all these sort of things coming out, and I recognizing at the time, there's sort of that, like, don't ever meet your heroes, or we have to kill our heroes kind of thing as well. But I was recognizing at that time, and I mean, to dive right into it, also you speak about this in your work in the opening of Burden and Peace. I was also working under Neil MacLeod. So there was abuse happening there. He had been suspended. There was things that had gone on. And so in that time in my life, there were lots of Indigenous men letting me down, lots of men letting me down in many, many different ways. And at the same time, it's a moment of me kind of figuring out who I am. And so when I do performances, I often make the joke, it took me a long time to realize I was a man, because I didn't want to be, because men are trash, right? And I usually deliver it funnier than that, and the whole audience sort of laughs, but also takes that breath. And I think that poem that you've picked out, when you say it stopped you in your tracks, that's like, sometimes it's, as a poet, you want to suck all the air out of the room. And I think for me, I've had very difficult conversations with some of my uncles even, who get defensive and say, like, you're painting all men like this, or, I mean, we've heard it, not all men, all the time. And yet, as somebody who has lived on both sides of the gender binary, I always say, like, but it's all women. So if it's all women that have impacted and been experienced this, then it has to, in some ways, it has to be all men. And so when I ask that question about how do I become a man, how do I do this in a way that honors who I am, but also protects women, I never, ever want to make a man feel the way that men made me feel. I never want to make a woman feel the way that men made me feel growing up and in those things. So asking those questions and really trying to find out who the role models were, where they were, and whether we have any. To be honest, that's how hopeless it felt in those moments and in those times as I was picking things up. So our trained bodies know dangerous men, the way they won't listen, let up, distance, keep calm, but no, nobody will come. So you de-escalate and stall until a safe berth is reached, wide enough and far, with people around.
You were speaking about the ways that you felt as a woman in terms of interactions with men. Could you perhaps speak about the embodied aspects of those kinds of emotions and how they might resonate differently for you in your current sensibility?
Definitely. I think this is one of those, like, not that bad moments, or not that bad stories, right? And I just when I say that, I want to honor Roxane Gay has an essay collection called Not That Bad. I highly recommend it. It's devastating, but it's basically, she wanted to talk about sexual abuse and look sort of towards a future, and realize that people still needed to tell these stories, and that as women, we are all often, I say we now, and it's hard because these are the reasons why English fails us. But as having lived experience as a woman, we're taught certain things, and then also we're always qualifying it. Well, it wasn't that bad. Well, at least I was passed out, or at least I was this, or at least he didn't do this, or at least it wasn't that bad, because there's always a story worse. But in this is like kind of one of those moments where, to me, was a big shift. And it was I was like probably closer to a year in transition, and for anyone who's gone through medically transitioning, especially as a trans man, there's a lot of changes, and there's sort of periods of time. You don't just, it's not just a switch. You can switch your pronoun, but it's not just a switch for people. And so I was in a, I had gone in to buy cigarettes, and I got ID'd, and my ID still had a picture of me before. And so with like long hair and, you know, and so I handed it to the person, and he looked at it, and he looked at me, and I said, yeah, I need to get that changed. And he was like, no, you're pretty here. And I was like, huh. Like, but that's not the shocking part. The shocking part for me was the feeling that I had was so much more extreme because it had not happened to me in so long. And it used to be a daily thing. That used to be a thing. I used to serve tables. That used to be a thing. When I was 17 years old, I served tables, and I worked at a Scottish pub, and we wore like kilts, which was a glorified schoolgirl sort of outfit. And, you know, the kinds of things that I was facing on a consistent basis at that age. And it's constant. It's so much so that you will ask a woman like, well, I'm sure you faced harassment, and they'll go, no, like nothing that bad or nothing, you know. And then if you start actually like, well, do you ever get catcalled? They're like, oh, that, like, because it's so consistent, right? And especially if you're a body that doesn't fit the, you know, I mean, if you're an attractive body, sure, the desirability politics, you're getting different attention, but also like if you're fat, or if you're black, or if you're, you know, all of these things look a little bit queer, there's a difference in the way you're interacting. So I will say that, yeah, a few things there, whereas like, so one of the things I noticed is that men touch each other a lot, and you'll, I mean, you got the hockey bro, right? So you got the like, so, and I will say like in that first bit when I started to be perceived as more masculine, and I would get like the like, hey bud, like they'd sort of do this thing, and I would be like, like my entire body would freeze, because it was like, why are you touching me, right? And because I was so used to things like in a serving environment where men would just put like, always here, like, don't touch women here, don't do that, like. But it's like this sort of like, or hand on your back, this sort of ownership of your body, and it's this space where, like, we call fight, flight, or freeze, right? And women are taught to freeze, and not just freeze, but fawn. So like, it's okay, and you know, everything's okay, because as much as you can do to get, like, that poem speaks to that. Whatever you need to do to get out of this moment alive, basically. Like, even if it's not that bad, even if there are people around, that's what your body response is doing. And so it was really interesting to me to sort of transition, and then recognize that like, this wasn't a threat. This wasn't a threatening, you know, the like, just the pat on the back was a different thing. And the physicality of that was very different. And so I think, you know, these are the spaces. And I think another story I've shared in other places is I lived in Saskatchewan for my master's degree. And as a Indigenous woman, it was terrifying. Like, I didn't go many places at night. I didn't go many places. Like, I was very scared. I had never lived out there. And then flying back into Saskatchewan, post-transition, coming for a conference, after Colton Boushie had been killed, I had a moment flying in being like, oh, this is new. I'm an Indigenous man now. And so the fear is different, but it's there. So now when I pass a cop, it's different. Whereas before I might have, you know, I think I've gotten out of more than a few tickets crying, or, you know, got an easier ticket, or, you know, those sort of like those things that we use to like the feminine that we use, the power that like women have to use, because that's kind of the only power they sometimes think they have. And then for myself, or that I thought I had, I should say, or for myself now, I'm sort of like, you know, very quiet, very much like, if I get pulled over, it's like, I don't want to be seen as a threat. So yeah, there's a lot more to that. Even just seeing threat. There was a point where I stopped going into women's washrooms, not because I'm more comfortable in men's washrooms, because I have no, it's all uncomfortable. Gender neutral washrooms everywhere for everybody, but that's I stopped going into women's washrooms because I felt that it was then uncomfortable for them. And that I didn't want to make women feel uncomfortable. And I shouldn't say, you know, it's not saying like that I think women should police me and kick me out of a bathroom, but more that that's sort of like, if I'm walking behind a woman and I think, oh, I'm going to cross the street because I'm too close, and those kind of things. I'm aware of space in that way because I lived that. There's no gender here. Equal parts truth in balance. No need for power. We'll find a word that fits more. Something like no-go. Something like Ode. Something like this place. My heart.
I connect those two passages is firstly that although your work, it does, you know, nod in the direction of aspirational masculinities, it places those within a context where the greatest value is the genderless space, the space in which all of oneself can be actuated. And so the genderless space is crucial, but that genderless space doesn't deny the value of nourishing masculinities. But I put it next to the other quotation because in much of the work around critical Indigenous masculinity studies, there's a lot of skepticism for really good reasons about that work and about, you know, some work that I do. And I think a lot of people feel that masculinity has been so saddled by the history that it has inherited and the violence in which it's been implicated, that it is irredeemable. And, you know, the question is, when I see, we'll find a word that fits more. So my question for you is, given the importance of the genderless space, do we kick masculinity to the curb and find the word that fits more?
I think I love this question. I love this question because sometimes people, like, I'm a stickler for words, obviously. So I get, like, you know, I get people that are like, oh, it's just the word. I said, no. Here's the difference. This is the difference, right? So I want to tie this question, and this is how I talk about, like, looking at it holistically and connected. I want to tie this question to, I get many students that come into my classes and are like, well, I don't like the word settler. Or I don't feel like a settler. My family's been here for 4 generations. And I'm like, well, that's technically the exact definition of settler. Like your family settled. That's what it means, right? But instead of, like, one of the things that I challenge them, I say, well, why don't you like it? I'm like, well, it's got all these horrible connotations. And I say, so why don't you change that? Like, if that's what they're going to call you and you don't like what that word means, make that word mean something different. And that's where I'm like, sure, we could throw away masculinity, and then what? We're just going to say that men should not be men, or should, whatever it is. I think women have every right to throw away masculinity. Women have every right to say, I'm not going to read your work on masculinity because prove it to me. Show me who you are. And I don't want to read your work because I know that, like, you know, it's not you, Sam, but like, no one read, but, like, we've seen what men who work on Indigenous masculinities have done in this world. Like, we've talked about that abuse, right? And the ways in which abusive men step forward and talk about those things and use those things and tell, you know, talk about the women, and they say all the right things because that's a way to be abusive. That's a way to get into those circles. It's also a way, I think, to lie to themselves and trick themselves. But I think for me, like, what is the good of throwing the word away? What is the good of getting rid of it? I think the idea of a genderless space, the idea of opening up this, is that we each get to define it. So it's to say, like, if you don't like the word masculinity, like, find that, why not? And what is it about that that's sitting here that you don't like, right? And I do think, like, I have to say, I do think that there's a narrative of, like, survivors being allowed to do whatever they want, and if they don't want to be around men, or they want to hate men, all right, fine. like whatever they need to do in these periods of time. But I also say, like, what are we going to do? Have communities without men? Like that, what is that going to do for us? We need everyone. And I come from a nation of, like, I think we're 1,000 enrolled, right? I mean, which is not, we're still constellations, and we're bigger than what's in status and non-status. But if we think about that, my teachers say there's not enough Tunaka to even lose one. So if that is how I'm supposed to live my life, then it is my job. It is one of my roles, especially because I am, according to the sort of TERFs, or trans exclusionary radical feminist, right? I'm a gender traitor. So if that's who I am, if this is like, and I like gender traitor, I'm like, sure, that's great. But if that's like, sometimes I believe I'm here and this is why I'm doing this, so that I can talk to men in a different way. It was a whole life. Despite the newly minted birth certificate, it was a whole life. As I get deep in albums posted years ago, I see her and cry. So many tears for that girl. Never comfortable. Remove, tag, delete. Think of the conversation in Aurelia. Do we take it down? The monuments of colonialism? Do I deny her? Erase the evidence of her unhappy life? People like to ask, will I cut parts of her off? Oh, but how I did. Always cutting off, suffocating my spirit, drowning out my fire. I look at her now and cry for the hidden me. Under so much pain, uncomfortable clothes, lipstick and hangovers, and that man I was with. Thank you, Kulilo, for the teachings you bring us. Caterpillar too, still turning to mush, still needing to build cocoon, to find a safe nest, still always changing, still transitioning, just as we all are, always.
Again, this is an extremely important, it's a cadence in the collection. The collection is very much about transitioning, but not about the transition, right? It's not about a teleological, in my reading, it's not about a teleological sense of an end point or a destination. It's about the ways in which constantly reinventing oneself can lead to self-love and purpose and strength, And so I just wondered if you could talk about how I guess you intended to use transitioning throughout this collection, and then also how that relates to you individually, but also in that, as you wrote there, to everyone. Like, why is it important that all of your readers understand that transitioning is a constant state of being?
I think because that's all there is. I mean, I think I think about, so I'm just gonna show the cover again. Like, this is this is 2 years, like that selfies is like 2 years of my life, and like I'm really femme in a lot of these. And one of my favorite stories is one of my nieces being like, this is by our friend Smokii, but he's not a lady. Like, she was very confused at who was on the cover. And also, like, the little old ladies, like, they would come up and they'll go, oh, is this all you? Like, it's confusing, right? But I think one of the things, so there's two things to that. And because there's a part of that is, yeah, I'm talking to cis people, but a part of it is I'm talking to cis people to affirm trans people, which is to say that trans people are valid regardless of whether they're on hormones or have surgery or like ever medical transition at all, or even if they ever come out, or even if they're just, whatever it is, if they know who they are. And I think this is where we can, at some point talk about like two-spirit identity. But I think one of those pieces of that with transitioning was that I really actively want to change the world. So as an example, like I often say, I do lots of workshops on this kind of stuff and on two-spirit resurgence or two-spirit identity. And I think people will use the statistics of suicide against us. So they'll say, oh, like, 47% of trans people attempt, I don't know my numbers, I'm terrible with numbers, so please don't quote me on this. But like 47% of trans people have attempted suicide, right? So so of course, transgenderism is the issue. But we're not trying to kill ourselves because of who we are. It's because of the way the world treats us. It's because of the way the world defines us, right? It's because it's so hard to live in a world that is extremely gender binary, because we get misgendered, we get all this stuff, we get seen in a certain way. So with this genderless space and this talking of all of us transitioning, this is the magic of being trans. I've seen recently some memes going around the Native community that says, if I come back in another life, I sure hope I'm two-spirit again. Which is like I get the like, because that's the reality. I really hope that I'm trans again, because being trans, like one of my friends says, oh, you say you're trans, and people go, oh, you're so brave, oh, it's so hard, oh, it's this. It should be a freaking birthday party. It's a congratulations. It's the most beautiful thing it's a baby being born, right? It's these moments, it's these worlds being born within us, right? I do believe this. I really actually believe this, because it's like, if you think you own somebody in a relationship, if you think that person owes you until death do us part, that it becomes this like heteronormative monogamous thing that is just like, right? If you look at Indigenous relationality, Indigenous kinship, this galaxy that says we're all connected, if you look at the stars and you think, does that star over there, is it mad that star hasn't talked to it lately? Like, I mean, it's just like, what is this? We are bigger than this. We can be bigger than this. And I think the thing about trans magic is like, I just go, thank God I was trans, because I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to just change. I had to find who I was. It was so strong within me. I was running from it so hard that was going to kill me. If you're somebody who feels pretty comfortable, maybe you're a little left to center or whatever, maybe you're a little bit whatever, but like you're pretty comfortable in who you are, it's going to take you a lot longer to cut through any of those bounds.
How was your experience of holding close earlier parts of yourself? And do you think that's an important thing for trans people to do?
Oh, Canadians love their monuments. Holy. Like, it's unbelievable, really, like the kind of backlash against this stuff, right? And so like this idea of like, do we take it down? Do we take it down, right? And then like whiteness will say, well, we can't take it down. They should just have they should have a different story, or they should do this, or they should do that. Or they'll be like, we should put an Indian there. And you're like, we don't have monuments. We didn't have that stuff. You know what we had? We had stories. Like, if you can, like, going to look at a monument and reading the little thing, right? Like, it's like, what does that tell you about anything? And how much do you remember it? When you drive away from there, what story do you remember it, right? Whereas sitting with my elder, who has since passed, and hearing the story of, here we have like Mount Baker here. Again, this context, it's a kinmi. A kinmi is what it's called in our language. You know, I was laughing because Mount Baker is like, there's this giant Mount Baker in Washington. And I was going, why do we have a Mount Baker? And then I like see it's this like little mountain here. I'm like we know names after white guys and these kind of things. And this, I want to talk to this with, and I know we're talking about my transition and stuff, but Dr. Christopher Horstey, who's Tanaka, he talks about how we're, and I always get exoteric and esoteric mixed up, so I'll just say, he talks about how we're high context cultures and how Western is a low context culture, right? So this idea that we will just bring names, we will just bring this thing. And so here, like, you wouldn't name another place at Kinmi, because at Kinmi is about the arrows that they shot into the mountain to get up there. And it's like the story is, it ends up being like the story of the creation of like flying squirrel and bat and suckerfish, but also that name because they shot arrows to get up into the sky. So there's like this beautiful story about it. And you wouldn't go name some other place that, because it's what happened there. And so these are these things about like monuments and all this kind of stuff, is like people think that, well, white people, it's just amazing. Like whiteness and settler Canadian, like they look at us and they go, well, you didn't write it down, so nobody will remember it. Nobody remembers the things that are written down. Like, have you, like I go, okay, well, I like at the college right now, something's going on, and I go, well, this is what I was told over here by Chris. And he says there's a document somewhere, and they go, well, we don't know, we can't find that document. You're the ones that talk about, like, your system is supposed to work so well. You've got file cabinets that sit there for 7 years, and then it all gets shredded. Like, does anyone know anything that's happened here? Does that president have any responsibility to anything the last president said? No. Do you know what our chiefs have? Responsibility to what the chiefs did in the 1800s. And we only know that because of our stories, right? And so, to me, the trans narrative, the white trans narrative is like, they have this thing called dead names, right? That's how they think about it. And I'm not taking this away from anybody. So please, if you have a trans person in your life, do not use me to tell them that they shouldn't call it dead names, or that you should be allowed to use their name, or you're not allowed to do any of that. Listen to the trans person in your life and whatever they're telling you. Because they might be at a stage of their transition where hearing a different pronoun or name makes them want to die. And I was at that period. I was at that period where looking at those pictures was so painful, because that person was so hurt, was so sick, was running so hard, and just wanted to be loved, just wanted to be heard and seen and witnessed. And I spent most of my life that way. So still sometimes when I see that, I just feel grief for her. So to me, honoring her and carrying her, yes, always, always. And now I'm in a state, I'm in a stage where I'm almost 3 years on testosterone. I've carried the name Smokii for just a little over 3 years. And I mean, which feels like a lifetime. It's unbelievable how quick it can just be who you are. But when I look at those pieces, like, of course I carry those experiences.
I thought it would be unkind to our viewers if we didn't talk about erotics for a bit.
There you go.
But
this is why I brought the quill here. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Forget the bad sex. I want to read the good, the genderless space.
So the two questions that come out for me about that is, why is it so important to celebrate the good sex? Why is it that a focus upon the nourishing and nurturing and mutually generative intimacy is something we need to do more of? And then secondly, do you feel as though the best sex ultimately needs to be genderless?
Ooh, like, this is a great question. Yeah, so I mean, it's the same thing I talk about, again, like tying all this, this is where things aren't separate, right? Is that, like, teaching Indigenous literature, typically people come in and they start teaching it and it's like all devastating tragedy. And I mean, this is I'm not the first person to say this by any means. I think Daniel talks about this. I think Rick Ouellette was my first teacher of, he taught an Indigenous justice course at SFU. And what he would do, because it was heavy, right? We'd be reading treaties, we'd be reading history, we'd be reading all these, like, I mean, Indigenous justice, like, it was, settler colonialism, talking about the ways in which their justice, is genocide to us. So doing that, he would come in at the end of every class and be like, hey, we need somebody bring in, or he would bring in a piece of Indigenous joy, a story, a good story, right? And that would be how we ended. And so I actually recently just did a summer reading group on Black authors who, N.K. Jemisin, by the way, science fiction goddess, like her work is incredible. And then also read Desmond Cole's The Skin We're In and Janet Mock's Redefining Realness. And Janet Mock is a Native Hawaiian Black trans woman. And Desmond Cole is a Black journalist from Toronto. So we read these 3 books over 12 weeks, and it was like Smokii's book club. I'm like, I had this dream that it was going to be like a more communal thing, and I was like, I guess I'm leading this thing. So now we're, soon I'll be the next Oprah. No, I'm just kidding. But Smokii's book club was pretty fun. But I made it I borrowed that, or learned that from Rick, and so I always had celebrating Black joy at the end, right? This thing. So the thing about it is, like, how are we ever going to imagine our ways out of abuse? I look at my elders, and nearly every one of them faced abuse, like, as a child, sexual abuse in residential schools, over and over again. sometimes by other students, sometimes by, you know, priests, adults that were supposed to be taking care of them. And then you look at generations of that in our community. Those are the realities. GR Grit has a new album coming out called The Quiet Years. They have a song called The Quiet Years. And they told a story of hearing one of their aunties or elders, grandmothers, I'm not sure exactly who, saying that was, oh, those were the quiet years when nobody was singing or praying. Nobody was singing or dancing. And here they'll go, oh, that's when we were all drinking. And this is like the 70s, 80s, right? 60s, 70s, 80s. Because all of their children have been taken away because they had suffered so much abuse. And so I started thinking about healthy sexualities, and I started thinking about how do we talk about this. And there's I think they're called Amic Consulting, but there's in Sioux Lookout, Melody McIver and Aaron Consmo are starting this sort of consulting business on Indigenous sexualities and healthy sexualities. And I just think like Two-Spirit people are leading the way in this, and women. I mean, Tenille is one of them. I think Tenille's work is super underrated in Can Lit because they just don't understand it. But Tenille's work is the work that as soon as a student comes in that is in my class that has lived on a res for any amount of time, I give them Tenille's work, and they bring Tenille's work back to the res, and then they hand it around to their cousins. And it's revolutionary because it's opening up conversations. And Tenille will say it's the conversation with the aunties and the cousins around on Sunday mornings or that kind of thing, right? But I think about how we haven't been allowed to talk about sex or have healthy sexuality in our communities for generations. And I think that I'm speaking to my generation, but I think that this comes from a generation of people who, you know, there are no bedrooms and teepees, right? Of this reclaiming sexuality of Gregory Schofield as one of the, you know, big voices of Christos, of, you know, these sort of like where those erotics come from. Coley Driscoll, Daniel, this, you know, Sovereign Erotics is one of the texts I'm thinking of. And so what does it mean to reclaim those sexualities, and what does it mean to celebrate those sexualities and honor them in these like incredibly beautiful ways, right? And then also being like, you know, with all that trauma, how do we heal that embodied trauma that is in us? How do we heal from, as a body that has had abuse, what happens when you get touched a certain way? How do you find a space that is so safe that if you get triggered, you can say, like, I need to stop, or maybe not even say it. This is the thing about consent. People think it's, oh, is this okay? Yes. Verbal consent is there, but your bodies will stop you if you're paying attention and listening well enough. And so how do we teach that? To listen to your own body and the person you're with at a level that you understand consent entirely, that there is no power here, right? This genderless space. Do I think sex needs to be genderless? I think, again, it's the concept. It's the concept of, you know, like, I mean, I transitioned and then was like, wow, I'm straight. Do I have to give up the queer label? Because I'm pretty straight now. I don't know what happened. I don't know what to do. Feels weird, right? But there's something about, you know, like just figuring out, and it doesn't have to be genderless, but it has to be negotiated together. This is the secret, men. I posted those consent poems. I put them in my book, and I'm telling you, consent is sexy. Consent, you say the freaking word, and the women are like lined up at coming to get me, like signing the books, and they want poems, and they want this, and they want that, and they're like having a reaction to just me talking about consent. And I do think that we're in a world where things like Tinder and things like all of this, like colonialism takes away our relationships, right? And all these adaptations take away our relationships, and they take away the ways in which we can actually connect to each other. And I think lately I've been sort of conceiving of a sacred intimacy. And whether or not gender is there, I mean, that's that's between you and your partner and how that looks. At that time in my life, a genderless space was one of the most beautiful things I could think of, because my body parts didn't matter, and they don't matter in the same ways that it's thought of, right? Like, because you can, I mean, they do and they don't, right? I mean, I'm still striving for top surgery so I can live in the world, still trying to have those conversations, right? But as my body continuously changes, I can feel more comfortable with different things. And then also like not caring about what it looks like to the outside world anymore, but just what it looks like in this moment, in that space, to be present with each other.
My first time was good. When I say this to women, they are often shocked. We are taught instead it should hurt, that it's breaking something inside you. Not taught our pleasure, only shame. Turn the lights off, normal is for him. Wait through long pounding hours or just a second. This never happens. Taught to hold our breath, stare at how many ceilings, to-do list in mind. My first time was good. The consensual first time. The one that I count. He smelled so damn good, had softest tie thread count sheets, made crepes when we woke. Yeah, I stayed the night. And isn't that what we need? Radical balance. I wish that for you, a revolution of sex. For every human, softest sheets and crepes, or rose petals, candles, tender exploring. Whatever you like. Maybe punk rock in the floor if it turns you on. Creating the world, each ask, each yes at a time. Co-write the story.
And again, you know, I teach that in my classes, and students just are so empowered by those lines and also attracted to them. They want to talk about them, right? And they want to talk about consent. And so you've explained a lot of the complexities of consent and how that co-writing of the story actually creates more capacity for joy, you know? And I think about that in relation to what Daniel has argued about, like sex being entirely screwed up by the models of extraction, or, you know, that the male body is, we're taught that it's either assaultive or extractive, and that sexual joy is something you take from someone else, as opposed to something that you mutually generate together, and that mutual generation is all the more powerful. But I want to ask you about vulnerability. You mentioned Tenille Campbell's work before, and you shared the photos that Tenille took in Vancouver and that are in that incredible piece that you wrote. And I just would like you to talk about that process, if you could, like of the actual day of taking those photos, the vulnerability that that you expressed in doing that, but also how your relationship with Tenille and Tenille's artistry and care made that plausible. And what does vulnerability mean in relation to the good sex that we want to make the norm?
So I think there's some things that I look at with vulnerability where I see people sort of throw trauma at others sometimes. I think that can be a really abusive relationship thing too, right? Where it's like, you know, this really bothered me. And then they're like, well, that's because, you know, this happened to me when I was young. And you're like, okay, like, so you might know why, but like, have you done any work on fixing that so that maybe you can be in relationship easier? And I was somebody who did this too, right? Like you can throw trauma at somebody, you can use it as a weapon. And so one of the things that I look at with vulnerability is, why are we doing it? Am I doing it because I need you to validate me? And actually that essay you speak of, just make me look like Aquaman. This essay where we did this thing with Tenille, this photo essay, I actually had one of my mentors say to me, he's like, oh, I hate when you share that essay. Every time you share that essay, I think it just feels like you're like trying to get us to affirm that you're a man. Because the last part is like, I finally see myself. I see myself as my mother's son. And I just looked at him and was like, what? Like no, like I'm over that. Like that was like a couple years ago, worrying about that, like how people saw me. I was like, no, I think you misread that because I think you thought it was for you. and it's not for you. And this is where, like, you know, Leanne says this all the time. I write for Anishinaabe First, Leanne Simpson. It's like, I wrote that essay, and I sat on that essay for a long time, and I'm an Insta poet. I like the buzz of posting something and having it be like right now interacted with. But this was when I sat for a long time, because it was, in a way, it was a ceremony. There was a piece of it that was a ceremony, and there was a piece of it where Tenille, like, I asked Tenille for because I knew she would see me, I knew she would take care of me. And she did really well, and she's just, it's an incredible piece. But it was for young trans kids or older. Or anyone that is going to see themselves in it, because, and I say it in that essay, but when I went to go transition and I was seeking out things, there's sort of this, like, if you're FDM, if you're watching this and you are part of this sort of like female to male trans community, there's these like these videos, and it's like, this is my month, or no, sorry, this is my voice 3 months on T, like, and it's like, this is my voice 1 year on T, right? It's like, and it's adorable, it's very cute, and it's very fun, and I probably, you know, had I found myself years earlier and all the stars aligned for me to be transitioning earlier, like, I would have loved that stuff. And I actually made some of those videos because I was just trying to figure out, I learned so much from those videos. I learned so much from Reddit threads. I learned so much from young trans people that are just telling their stories out there, because that's who knows things. The doctor doesn't know what's going to happen. They're just like, because it's like puberty. It is puberty. So it's like, you know, how some 12-year-olds have beards and some 17-year-olds don't, some 40-year-olds don't. Shout out to the niche men in the crowd. But yeah, and yourself, there you go. But I think, like, so seeing that that was the narrative, young white men, trans men, defining this narrative of what you're supposed to be, and never seeing a body like mine. And then actually I have to say, I spoke about GR Grit earlier, Grayson Grit, was somebody who transitioned publicly and who, the new album is amazing, but also like was a singer first. And so that helped me with voice stuff, because it was nerve wracking and all these kind of things, but also, you know, has a fat trans body. And like, it's like, oh, that's cool, because men aren't supposed to be fat either. Right. Like, I mean, it's this thing where, women and appearance, like, I will always say women's appearance is like completely judged more than men. And I can tell you, like, even just the way that I care about what I'm wearing, so much less now. Like, I still like to look good, but if I don't look good, like if I'm wearing like plaid on plaid by accident or whatever, like, I just don't have to think about it as much anymore. I just don't. It's not even like, because I'm not commented on all the time. So I want to just make that clear. But also, men we still have toxic masculinity, and like, you know, I want to be buff, I want to be this, I want to be that, whatever. So Gray is somebody who I saw myself in. And then just like other native trans men. But I wanted to put it out there that this body is a man's body, just as much as if I get to a point where those surgeries happen, or if I never do that, or whatever it is, I can just say that and be that and hold that. And one of the other reasons, and I have to say this, that I did that, and I had the privilege of doing it, because, to be honest, first of all, I put it on Tia Bennett because Tenille could protect me. So Tenille can take it at any second. I can tell her I want it down and it'll go down. And any comments, she's policing them. She's taking care of them. And I know that she's got me. I know that when trans women, I know that when Gwen put her body on the internet, she faced extreme hatred. There's a poet right now, Alok, I'm not going to get the last name, Alok, it's B Menon. There's a B name in there, and I'm apologizing. Incredible poet, incredible brown poet, and hairy, and embracing hair. But the posts, the things that are thrown at them, first, like, and I did that, and I got very little backlash. And so I have to say I had the privilege of doing that. But part of it is that I'm hoping that those things can change. I'm hoping that someday the reaction to a trans feminine person putting out their bodies in the world, that they're not getting that literal, that they're not dying Black trans women are the highest rate of murder in any community, and Indigenous trans women, like, it's terrifying. And so I look at, it's a privilege to be able to be vulnerable. It really is. But I do it so that other people can. And I did it for those kids to see themselves. I did it for people to go like, whoa, that kind of looks like my body.
Everything we share, all the beauty you can give, you as you are here, you are enough. And you deserve, above all, your autonomy.
You are enough is this cadence in the collection, and that sense of self-love that really carries. And how does that relate to how one connects to one's community?
I think I hate the concept of self-love. Oh my God, do I hate it. I'm like, throw it out. But also, like, this is me, redefine it. And I hate it because it's that, I'm sure we've all heard it. Love yourself. If you can't love yourself, you can't love anyone else. Right? What? Like, what? Some of the most incredible people I know. Well, I mean, so the last line, the title is also the last line in my book, You Are Enough. You have a place here, you are enough. And that is a quote from Carol Edelman Warrior, my ceremony mom, who passed in July 2018. And what I learned about Indigenous love is that you can't love yourself until you have community that loves you. You can't love you can sit there and try all you want. I've been in therapy since I was 12. I have been in treatment. I went to AA. I did a stint in Christian camp and did Christianity. I have been seeking my whole life. If you come from generations of love that was forcibly broken, and that we've been told we don't know how to parent or grandparent or love or care for each other, that's the narrative of what we're born into. And like, how are we ever going to learn? And I think like this idea of like, I'm going to sit here and love myself into being, like, fucking had me sitting at bars, drinking myself to death, right? Like, it was like, you cannot do this alone. The final thing that I want to say on that is Elder Herman Alpine, who passed this July 4th, the same day that my mom passed 2 years ago on July 4th. So it was quite I was like, he went into Paladin and I went, oh, you're going to go that? Okay. All right. 4th of July. So, change what the 4th of July means for sure. But Herman was amazing. And Herman was one of the first people to sort of welcome me home. And I got to spend a little bit of time with him before he left. And he taught me this word. And this is that thing of language translation. So like, people watching this are going to be like, because like out here, people, it's like the kiso kwetlam, kiso kyukit, kiso tishmi at like, good morning, good afternoon, good night. He's like, we didn't walk around saying good morning. Like, that's a white people thing. Like, I don't understand. You're just translating it so you can use it in the white world. Fine. He's like, but that's not how we greet us. And so how do we greet then? He's like, well, and then he had to think, it's funny, like, put him on the spot. Well, then what? Tell me. But, so he talked about when you see an old friend, you go, Akenes, give me your hand. And you reach out and you do the hug. Akenes, give me your hand. So it's like you do this thing. And I'm writing about this in my dissertation work, but what that means is, and this is what I love about this, is you can put your hand out and that other person has to meet you, right? You have to meet each other. And I can't even really this is what self-love, right? You can't actually do that by yourself, right? You can't take somebody else in by yourself. So that kind of thing, that reaching out and pulling in, right? And that reaching out and having that met, that thing, giving the pause, giving the ability to say no to things, right? Like, I mean, this is like, oh, duty to consult. Like, well, if there is no veto, if I'm not allowed to say no, it's not ever going to be consensual, right? If I have to go to your court system and fight you to say no, and then you get to decide whether or not my no is worthy enough, it's just rape. That's it. Like, there's no
like, I cannot understand the idea of like asking someone and then, you know, and that's what our culture is built on. Just steamrolling people, whatever I want, whatever I need, whatever, you know, progress, get that railroad through. I mean, it's its own phallic symbol of John A. MacDonald's Canada, right? We're talking about this and dreaming new ways out. The dream word is really important because I think it's this thing of dreaming new ways out, but recognizing that those dreams are attached to old ways. So those are the tobacco and the consent, the akin, it's good to see you, right? It's like good to see you again, and that reaching out. And what that tells me, because I often hear young people be like, those elders need to let us into ceremony like this. They need to be, I'm two-spirit, they need to let me come however I want to come. They need to do this, and they need to do that, and they need to... Whoa. What is your relationship to that elder? What have you done for them at all? Have you gone to chop wood? Have you gone to ask them if you have to wear a skirt? Have you offered that tobacco and said, hey, I'm two-spirit? You have to know yourself. And the thing about that's terrifying is that even me, I was like, I'm two-spirit. Okay, I got this. Like, whatever. I tell this, or like how I became to claim that term. And then I was at my family's house and they have a lodge. And she said to me, my mom said, okay, what side do you want to sit on? What do you mean? What do you mean, what side do I want to sit on? You're supposed to tell me what side to sit on. Like, you can't, like, what? And then, like, the first time I sat on the men's side, it was a super hot sweat, and I was convinced that I was being punished, which is not how it works. We got post-Christian stress disorder. Not how it works at all. But those kind of, like, that's me. That's me. That's not her putting pressure on me to decide if I'm a man right now. That's her opening up space, and my insecurity was like, what do? I guess I'll just sit over here because I don't really know. And that's where it's like, actually, I have to know. And I have to find, and I have to go out and ask those questions and seek those things out. And it doesn't mean like, I still don't know right now. Like right now I'm seeking my role at home. And it's like, well, I've only been here since November. I've been walking out on the land. I've been talking to them. I've been seeing, like, asking what opens up, and, you know, a job here might open up and this might happen. And who are my teachers? And it's like trusting and listening in a new way instead of forcing, like, I want this. Do you know what I mean? Like, I want this, so I'm going after it. That like Ayn Rand libertarian, like, step on anyone to get there, which was Fountainhead was my favorite book when I was 17. Don't tell. Okay, but because you're a teenager, and of course you want to step on everyone to get where you want when you're a teenager. Good thing we grow up. But yeah. So in all of this, I've been thinking about, we have to reach out and we have to reach back. Our communities have a responsibility to make space and welcome two-spirit people. Two-spirit youth have a responsibility to respect that knowledge has come from somewhere, and that if they want to change it, they need to know it. They need to connect to it. They need to be able to be flexible. We need to always be flexible. We need to be able to adapt, and we need to be able to take people where they're at, from our elders to our young people to like everywhere.
Well, this has been just an incredible couple hours for me, and I know it will be when others get to see this. And so thank you so much for the wisdom, the education, the laughter, calling me on shit when it requires calling on, and the generosity of spirit with which you've spoken today. I feel very honored to have been part of this. And would you like to finish with any final commentary or a poem?
I think I just want to read that poem. This is for my mom, because I think if we can go back to that, we were talking about Indigenous literature, because we had sort of set the tone about Richard Van Camp being who taught me how to be a man. One of the last things that my mom did, like a while before she went, or whatever, time isn't real, but that's a whole other thing. But my mom let a man sweat for us at one point, and she told us that we needed to take care of women. That's what we need to do. We've talked about this idea of warriorhood in some parts, and her name was Carol Edelman Warrior.
She was named after Old Lady Warrior, also known as Takes a Prisoner, who is Nina Grovant, one of the old stories, one of the old women who was one of the leaders. And my mom was a sun dancer, so you get the secret. That's a Sundance crown there. Some people don't know what it is. So I'll finish with that. For Carol Warrior, for Ka Manatla, our mother, for you, sun dancer, thank you feels too small. Ginihean, much closer, our hearts opened up, a new presence found, taught us how to love, taught us how to fight. Beauty surrounds us, that fierce love of creation, each tiny moment, and most important, our place within it all. You have a place here. You are enough. Usukil Kukni, Unaka Nakanini, I'm humbled. My heart is happy. Thank you.